a story doesn't just go out into a void. So a story like this kind of story that I have written um, that deals with, some difficult issues, it can have an impact on a community. So it's really important that the community has a say in what's going on in that story. Hi, my name is Lia Hills. My new book is The Desert Knows Your Name with Affirm Press. In the story, there's a young girl who walks out of Wimmera Desert who can't speak. And there's a character in the novel who is really interested in the wild child phenomenon, and who that's the sort of the story that she projects onto this young girl. There are a number of tropes that I engage with in the story. Some of those are really traditional kind of colonial literary tropes, like the lost in the bush story, and in some ways, the wild child one is connected to that as well. It's to do with fears around our relationship with the land, particularly in this country, and and also that kind of how we see the human compared to the non-human, which was really important for me in this novel, rather than sort of prioritizing the human in that sort of standard Western hierarchy, is to really think about our place in the order. It was really interesting to play around with those um, tropes, investigate them, unpick them, challenge them, in order to say something or question. I guess I'm always questioning rather than saying, is something about, particularly as a non-Indigenous writer, our relationship with the land and with the non-human, but also with the contested histories. So when I set out to write this novel, a big question for me was non-Indigenous relationship with land. What is my own relationship to it? How is that affected by the way that this country was colonized? And so I wanted to have a kind of like a cast of characters in the novel that had vastly different relationships with the land. Some of these characters, like Beth, one of the main characters in the story, where the young girl who walks out of the desert ends up staying with Beth. She's a regenerative farmer living on her family's land that's been in the family for many years. Um, Beth is trying to reassess the relationship that her family has with the land, or had with the land. And so for her, she's in a state of kind of flux. She's trying to work out how she can better care for the land. There are characters who have very traditional relationships, and I'm speaking in a Western traditional sense, in the way that they see of caring for the land is vastly different. For example, to say Indigenous characters who are in the book and who care for country. But I really played around with it. There are, without having, giving too many spoilers, there are people who really have quite a fetishized relationship with land, and I think that was really interesting for me to even push the boundaries on that. What might that mean if someone's relationship with the land is getting somehow distorted? So I had a lot of fun playing around with that as well. So there's sort of a whole spectrum of people with different relationships to the land. Given that a key thing that I was interested in this book was contested histories, and so much of history, is told by the conquerors, and the archives that exist often dominate the historical narrative. So I was really interested in other histories, whether those histories might be embedded in the land, like visually, materially, but also histories and stories that aren't told, that are re-emerging. Um, and so going to the archives was a really interesting thing to do, repurposing archives within the book. And so again, don't want to be giving any spoilers, but I did I think, some really interesting things in the book, playing around with those archives, particularly archives that deal with um, voices that were very dominant in history, white male voices. And then I also there's a moment in the book where You're also seeing a letter from an Aboriginal woman from that area who was in the mission, one Ebenezer mission. And that was really important to do that. I mean, it was done in consultation with the Barinji Land Council, who are the representative body for the traditional owners up there, because it's set in the Wimmera, which are the traditional lands of the Watchabolik, Jadwa, Jabajali, Japulgul, Kanwe, Gaia peoples. And the idea behind that, and the thinking behind that, was to give a space for an Aboriginal woman to speak. And as a non-Indigenous writer, I can't be writing Aboriginal characters, but I can provide a space where an Aboriginal woman can speak for herself. So permission was gained from the family, and by the process of sensitivity readings, it felt that was an appropriate inclusion. So those archives are there, but they're not neutral. So it was interesting to be able to engage with those in a fictional space. And also, I think it's quite, for me, it was intriguing to think about the relationship between, real documents, non-fiction, and fiction, how they play together. Isn't history just a fiction? It's just another, there are many, many versions, many stories told. So yeah, I'm hoping that the reader will find that an intriguing experience to engage with those, real documents. So over a decade ago, I went camping with my family in the Little Desert National Park, and I remember when I was there, the sort of the confluence of desert and river and small town. It's quite an unusual, particularly in Victoria, to have that sort of those three coming together. So I thought, that's kind of really ripe in terms of place and setting, but I didn't have a story at the time. I was working on other things. And then when I got the idea for a, investigating non-Indigenous relationship with land, but that idea was always very central to the genesis of the story. But then getting this idea about this girl walking out of the desert, how interesting it would be that people, if she's not speaking, that, everyone would project their story onto her. Then I remembered the setting and felt how interesting, because my previous novel, The Crying Place, was set up, in the Northern Territory, in what a lot of people traditionally considered Australian deserts. People don't think of Victoria in deserts. And I think it's easy to distance yourself, as an urban reader, and go, those are the deserts, that's the outback. Whereas in Victoria, a Victorian desert is doesn't really fit in the imaginary, I think, of a lot of people. So that was really interesting to play around with. So you can use all those sort of interesting ideas that are connected to deserts as being sort of these sparse places where people go to find out things, to discover themselves. But it's really close. It's like 3 hours from Melbourne, So I found that a particularly interesting setting. And then, of course, began this journey of learning about this place in great depth over many years, and meeting many members of the community who taught me about this place, sort of materially, mythologically, historically. Really core to the politics of the book was specificity of place. I really wanted to render the Wimmera in its detail, and it's a microcosm of any place that you might find in Australia, or anywhere in the world really, but in terms of its specificity, because we have a lot of people in this country have a tendency to think of eucalypts, gum trees, but wouldn't be able to identify more than maybe one or two. When it comes to grasses, even worse. And including myself, I had a real grass blindness when I first started researching this book, and, got mocked by a few people that I hang out with about that. So it was really important for me to gain that knowledge over time from a variety of sources, mostly hands-on. So I spent time hanging out with regenerative farmers, actually harvesting native seed that was being, like my character does in the book. When it comes to plants, a lot of people use the common name, and the more that you hang out with plant experts, you become very aware. Like, I have these friends that if you're hanging out with them and I go and stay with them, they speak to each other in Latin all the time because they only use the Latin term. And if I say, what plant is that? They go, oh, hang on, I'll have to look it up for the common name, because they're thinking in terms of its classification, a very Western relationship with land, deep knowledge, and knowledge that's developed over time, and understanding of seasonal change, climate change within that knowledge. But then becoming aware of the fact that this, in the Wimmera, there are aware Gaia names for those plants, some of which are commonly shared in various publications, others which are in a state of being revived in their usage. And these names, their visibility, new visibility often, because they were not known for a while, not shared for a while, and the fact that those vocabularies are being expanded, or that words may have fallen potentially out of permanent usage, all speak to the history of that place. So I try to incorporate that as well, that sense of naming, how important naming is, where names come from, what name dominates, even in relation to a plant, and how some plants also and animals have gone, have gone into near extinction, are re-emerging, and the languages also of plants and of animals in the Wimmera. So I spend a lot of time sitting recording. So I use voice recognition to create the first drafts of my novels. And that idea is so you speak, and then it loads up onto the laptop, or sometimes I use it on my phone as well. And it's about really embedding myself in a place and listening, seeing what emerges, because the voice recognition software will pick up my voice, but it'll also pick up other sounds, which it converts into English words. And so it's about, do you see that as a mistake, or do you see that as other languages being made apparent to you? Yeah, it might not make any grammatical sense, but it's creating an awareness of other sounds that are going on. And the more that you listen, you begin to see that that bird has moved closer, and another bird of the same species is speaking to it, but they seem to be responding to your presence. And then other birds are seeming to join in that conversation. If you sit quietly enough and then begin to narrate those experiences, in language, English language, via the voice recognition software, you become aware of yourself as one language amongst many, which is not, in my culture, that's not the way that I was raised. You go out and you use the human language, and the others are just, bird song or whatever. But even the wind through trees, you become aware of the direction of the wind. You become aware of, the components of a tree that lead to the sounds that it makes. So, whether it's going through the needles of a bull oak, which is a very whiff kind of sound, or, it's the rattling of bark, which makes a whole nother sound. Being in the mallee, lots of mallee have that sort of really dangly bark. So yeah, you begin to listen to those other languages, you begin to listen to the country around you, and you feel way more embedded in it, in its stories and its histories and its languages. Key to the writing of this book was the engagement with the Land Council, and also using sensitivity reader. It's so important, because when you're writing a book on the land, you're on someone's country. And a story doesn't just go out into a void. So a story, like this kind of story that I have written, that deals with, some difficult issues, it can have an impact on a community. So it's really important that the community has a say in what's going on in that story, and that, cultural information is not only being checked. It's not about a question of ticking boxes, but engaging on a deep level with the First Nations community there, to make sure that what you're writing, you've understood what the impact of that might be. And also it's, it's a two-way thing. So you end up you're learning from those engagements, because it was read at various levels by the Land Council, and then a final reading with Kat Clark, amazing Watchabolic woman who did the final sensitivity reading, and just the relationships that are formed there, and what you learn through the response that you're getting from your readers. makes the story so much richer. This novel took a long time to write. It took 6 years. Um, and that is, partly because of COVID, because trying to get up to the Wimmera, I go up a lot to do research for my books. The cultural engagement, that's about developing relationships, and it takes time. It's a beautiful part of the process, and you want to give it the time that it needs. And like learning about the plants, and that sort of depth of knowledge. Again, it's built over time, and so much of this book also is about the relationships I've developed with other communities up there, plant and animal and bird experts, but also artists, farmers, a whole, variety of people. So it's not just a matter of extracting information and, putting it in the book. It's about learning over time, developing your knowledge, developing those relationships, which have turned into long-term friendships on numerous occasions as well. So yeah, it is an in-depth process, but couldn't have done it any other way. So this is not the first novel that engages with the desert or with some of the themes that are in The Desert Knows Her Name. Um, they feel in a lot of ways connected for me because over time, this nation is changing in its conversation and its relationship with its First Nations communities and its sense of understanding of what constitutes the colony, both past, present, and for the moment, at least future. So, yeah, it's been really important for me to think about what I was able to do with the Crying Place. That's when I first learned to use the voice recognition software as a process. So it was really saying, okay, that was really interesting. How can I take that even further with this novel? I have a deep love for the desert, but yes, being able to engage with the desert closer to where I live was really fascinating, and think about some of those themes I developed in The Crying Place. How might that relate to a small fictional town, and very much this idea again about the Indigenous relationship to the land. So I do see that over time I'm understanding through response, reader response, taking the work out and into the public, what work I might be able to do as a non-Indigenous writer writing into this moment, um, and thinking about, again, what work can the novel do in this space? As a writer, obviously, you're working creatively. You want to write a beautiful sentence. You love that whole creative process. But I am very much a person who works embedded. I work a lot with First Nations communities as a curator, as an artist. So I have a much broader engagement with with various communities, Wurundjeri, where I live, and we see communities up in Wimmera. And so I'm often thinking about, what can the novel do in this space? What questions can I raise in my novels that will get people thinking? So I'm currently in the third year of my PhD, and I'm actually working on a hybrid text at the moment. So predominantly creative nonfiction, but it works with visual forms, poetry, some speculative work as well. And it's very much in dialogue with my last two novels, with The Crying Place and The Desert Knows Her Name. So it's about being a non-Indigenous writer, writing into this moment, the various processes that I use. What is the role of art in truth telling, and again, where does my role lie as a non-Indigenous artist or writer in that space? And it's addressed to a future descendant yet unborn. So it's sort of speaking to the past, to the present, and to the future, and challenging notions of Western notions of time. So yeah, I'm really enjoying that, and taking this book out to the public is almost like field work for me, really, with the PhD, because I'm getting to see how people respond to this work, and you're having conversations with people about what can a novel do, what is the role of a novel in questioning. Obviously it's not like a dissertation, right? So how do we use the creative process? How do we use language? How do we use engagement, politically, historically, narratively, to speak to this moment in this nation.